Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines where my guest is Brian Wilson. He is the East Baton Rouge Parish Tax Assessor. Brian's going to tell us about the kinds of taxes that are collected, how they're calculated, and what you can do to avoid paying more taxes than you have to. So join us on the next Legal Lines with Tax Assessor Brian Wilson.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I have a Legal Lines tip for you. Remember, knowledge is power. And I want you to know if you're injured and you have lost wages because of that injury, Louisiana law gives you a claim for that loss. Typically, it's going to require medical evidence from a medical doctor stating because of your injuries, you can't work. It's a pretty simple claim. If you had a job before the injury, doc says you can't work from the date of the accident, and 3 months later he says you can work, you can figure out what you've lost in wages. Circumstances occur, however, when the injury results in permanent physical and functional limitations. Now you can't do the job according to the doctor that you could do before the accident. So the question becomes, is there any work you can do, and what is the difference in wages? But the court doesn't just look at what you earned in the past, it also looks at your earning capacity. That is your ability to earn wages in the future, promotions, additional education. So my Legal Lines tip from me, Locke Meredith, to you is make sure you know your rights when you're presenting that lost wage claim.
This has been Legal Lines Tips.
Hello, welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. I'm very pleased to have on the show for the very first time Brian Wilson. He's the East Baton Rouge Parish Tax Assessor. Brian, appreciate you coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Let's dive in. Tell the folks a little bit about yourself and how you came to be the tax assessor.
I'm a lifelong resident here in East Baton Rouge Parish. I went to Redemptorist High School, attended LSU, and went to work for the assessor's office in
26 years ago?
26 years ago, September of 1990.
Unbelievable.
And so I got 26 years experience, the last 14 as the assessor.
Fantastic story. So you literally are the person that started at the bottom and now at the top.
That's it. So it's been very rewarding for me.
Excellent. Well, let's, I know I've never fully comprehended till I was getting ready for the show, kind of the whole process of how taxes are come up with and how they value my property and all that kind of stuff. I understand you just went through that process because state law requires that you do so. Explain to the folks.
We did. By law, state law, we're required once every 4 years to go in and revalue property throughout the parish, which we've just done. And we go in and look at see what the market's doing, what the analysis shows, and then we make adjustments from there and whether property values have increased or decreased, which the market has been very good in East Baton Rouge Parish, and so they seem to have increased.
That brings up an interesting question. So typically, I assume pretty much every time the property values have gone up, if it did go down, would y'all automatically reduce the taxes collected, or would that become the burden of the individual homeowner?
Well, not necessarily. The millage rates was actually increased to make the amount of taxes that was created the previous year the same. Just as the property values increase, the millage rates are lowered, then it's up to the particular agency to roll forward their millage or not, to generate that.
We'll get into that in just a second. So the bottom line is, y'all have just completed, as I understood it, from what, 2014 to 15 or 15 to 16?
2012 was the last reassessment, and we're in 2016 now. Okay.
And so y'all have looked at the last year's data?
We look at data from a 1 year time frame in the year, actually from June of 14, July 14 to June of 15. So we're looking at crunching numbers in that particular time frame to determine what the market's doing in each particular area.
And so the way y'all do that, you don't go study the valuation of every single house, as I understand it. You're looking at particular subdivisions and locales, and you're determining, I guess, an average price per square foot?
We are. We're looking at particular sales in a particular subdivision. We do mass appraisal because we have over 200,000 parcels of property in this parish, and so we'll determine what the values are doing in that area, and then make adjustments to the entire subdivisions.
And the valuation or reevaluation of the value of the property is based on appraisals that are done by these private companies. When you go to borrow money from a bank, they say, we got to appraise your property, right?
Well, it's based on sales. We're looking at sales, and that's determining really a good indication of what the market's doing out there, so we can determine what houses should be valued at.
Okay, and so when it's all said and done, you're looking at acts of sale that show the price of the property, but typically that's going to be evaluated by appraisers that are hired by the banks.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that makes sense. So, so once you get that data and you determine that For example, I believe I read that the value of property here in East Baton Rouge Parish has gone up by $135 million.
$135 million assessed value. And you have to remember too, assessed value is a percentage of market value. So yes, from 2015 to 2016, it went up $135 million assessed value.
Okay, so that now means that every agency or city that has a tax, they get more tax money automatically? Do they just not have to make a decision, or do they have the right not to accept more money?
Well, they have that right. You know, again, the millage rate is brought back, so they would generate the same amount of revenue that they did the previous year. So if they choose to and want to reap the windfall of the reassessment, they can roll that millage back forward to their maximum millage to reap the benefit and get more revenue from 2015 to 2016.
And who makes that decision?
Well, if it's an elected official, such as the sheriff, he makes a decision, or if the board of a particular agency, they would have to have a 2/3 vote to make that decision.
Okay, and so elected official, if the property values have gone up, he can say, you know what, I'm not going to take my higher taxes because property values have gone up. I'm going to reduce it down to the point that I get at least what I got last year.
Exactly.
Okay. I assume that doesn't happen too often.
Sometimes, a lot it did. I think in the last reassessment in 2012, I think probably the majority of the agencies out there chose not to roll forward. So we haven't gotten the information from the agencies back yet, so it's kind of to be determined what they're going to do this year.
Okay. And as I understand it, there's certain important key dates coming up right now. Explain to the folks what those dates are about.
Well, by state law, we are required to open up our tax rolls for public inspection for 15 days every single year in the months of August and September. So our first day will be open will be August the 26th, and that will run for 15 days through September the 9th.
And so if somebody's worried because they watch this show and hear the property value's gone up $135 million,
sure.
They come down, they look at the roll, and they go, there's no way my house is worth that much. What do they do about it?
Give us a call, and we'll be happy to go out and take a look at it. If there's something wrong with a particular home that property owner may say, hey, my property's not valued at what you have it at, then we'll go out, take a look at it, and kind of do a single property appraisal on it to see if there's an issue with it.
Okay, and then if they still don't think you're right, you say, I'm sorry to tell you, but your property's gone up in value, but you now owe more taxes.
Right.
If they disagree, what's their next options?
Well, if we disagree, there's a formal appeal process that starts with the Metro Council.
The full body?
The full body.
Wow.
And so if a decision is made there, whoever comes up on the short end, if they choose to, they can go on to the Louisiana Tax Commission, which is a state agency, and if they're not satisfied there, they go on to the court system.
I can't imagine that happens too often.
Not very often at all.
Okay, so bottom line is that's kind of the process as it relates to the reevaluation and how you can at least, discuss why it has gone up. All right. So let's explain to the folks now what a mill is, because as I understand all my reading, it's basically called if a tax is based on the number of mills that are agreed to.
It is. I guess a millage rate is basically the amount per 1,000 that is used to calculate taxes on a property. So if you have a millage rate times the total taxable value, that determines what your tax amount is.
So if I have a house worth $100,000 and I have a 10 mills tax on it, the tax is what?
Well, if you have a homestead exemption on it, you would subtract that value out of it. So you're probably looking at $250 to $300, depending on where you're.
Well, let's leave the homestead out right now. Let's say no homestead, got $100,000, 10 mills.
Roughly $1,000, depending on where you live out in the parish, because depending on what school district you're in, what fire district you may be in. All those factors come into play that determines the same value property in one area might have a different tax than another property located in another area.
And what I read, if you wanted a formula, a mill is 1/10 of 1%.
Correct.
Okay. All right, so that's how you calculate it. Describe kind of the process that goes forward. As I understand it, the commission, Louisiana Tax Commission says, yep, that's the number, it's official. What's the next step?
As far as an appeal process?
No. Let's say no appeals. Now the sheriff gets the information as I
understand. The sheriff gets the information. We provide that tax roll to the sheriff, and then they send out the bills, and they're obviously in charge of collecting the revenue also.
And you better pay that bill by 12/31 or penalties and interest, is that?
They do. They start kicking in January, and usually the sheriff, if they're not paid at the time that they hold their tax sale, which is usually in June or July, your property can be sold at auction.
All right, we'll continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines. My special guest, Brian Wilson, East Baton Rouge Parish Tax Assessor. We'll be right back.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I have a Legal Lines tip for you. Remember, knowledge is power. And I want you to know if you're injured, Louisiana law grants you a variety of claims to make sure you're fully compensated. It's generally chopped up into several categories, the first being general damages. That's going to compensate you for your mental and physical pain and suffering, your scarring, disability, functional limitations, your loss of enjoyment of life. Also, it will compensate your family, frankly, for your loss of affection. It's called loss of consortium claim. Next category is specific damages. Those would be, say, for example, past and future lost wages, past and future medical expenses. You also have a claim sometimes for what's called punishment damages or punitive damages, typically only available when you're injured by a drunk party. Finally, you're entitled to legal interest from the date you file your lawsuit until you're paid and court costs. So my Legal Lines tip to you from me, Locke Meredith, make sure you know what your claims are.
This has been Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. I'm pleased to have on the show for the first time Brian Wilson. He's the East Baton Rouge Parish Tax Assessor. Brian, we're talking about basically how taxes are collected and how they're calculated.
Right.
You brought up the Homestead Exemption.
Sure.
Bottom line is that's a significant way somebody can reduce their tax bill.
Very
right?
significant.
Explain to the folks what the Homestead Exemption is and how they get it.
Well, the Homestead Exemption it's $75,000 exemption, so it exempts you from paying taxes on the first $75,000 value over your home.
And this is the assessed value of the home?
This is it. Well, the fair market value is $75,000,
okay.
So 10% of that would be $7,500 assessed value.
Got it.
You can come to our office and apply. There are two basic requirements for Homestead Exemption. One is to own it, and one of the others to occupy it. You must live there. So it's a great advantage for homeowners, and that's, I think, why it was put into place years ago, was to encourage home ownership.
And as I recall, I may be wrong, but my memory serves, it's you don't have to own 100% of the house. It could be a percentage. Is that correct?
It could be. I mean, if depending on, you've got some area property, but again, you're only allowed one in the state, so that's the only caveat to that.
Okay. Explain that.
Well, again, if you have three owners of a house, you're allowed one homestead exemption in the state, and it depends on if all three people are living there. If you got two or one, whoever is living there is going to determine how much of the value of the homestead you get.
Got it. So you have to own at least an interest in the
yes.
home, and you have to be occupying
you have
to have
there.
access to that homestead exemption.
That's correct.
And when it's all said and done, it's going to save you what, $700, $800?
Yeah, depending on where you live at.
Right?
Absolutely, it's a big advantage.
Okay. So clearly everybody needs to know how to do that, and they can call y'all up. Let's also talk about the other features of your website, because folks have access to this information.
Well, they do. Our tax roll is on the website, so you can see not only your assessment, but the other assessments throughout the parish. Back when Kathleen Blanco was governor, and the transparency, we wanted more transparency in assessments, so that came about at that time. So on the website, we have a lot of information on there that tells you about the homestead exemption and tells you about property tax laws and things that are concerning the assessment process. I encourage people to go on and look at that. It's a great thing.
And what is it called?
ebrpa.org is the website.
Okay, maybe we can get a banner up during the show so folks can go there and learn more if they're interested.
Absolutely. We have a digital mapping system on there. It's a great thing that was input probably 2 years ago. It's the same mapping system that we use. It has a lot of information on there that you can see. It's got home ownership or property ownership.
And the amounts being paid in taxes, right?
Yeah, property dimensions, the value. So there's a lot of good information on there.
Excellent. Let's talk about any other ways that you can reduce your taxes. What are there?
Well, there is a way to freeze your assessment. There's the special assessment level in the state of Louisiana that if you're 65 years old and you meet an income requirement, adjusted gross income, if you come under that, then your assessment is frozen for as long as you're living in that home. So it's not necessary to say that your taxes will never go up. What this does is freeze the value. So in a reassessment year, every 4 years, if property values are rising, we will not...
You're not punished for it.
Exactly. And so now, but if there's a property tax that's created or approved by voters, your property taxes can go up due to that.
Okay, and you said there's an income limitation. Do you know what it is?
Well, it's around $72,000. It changes, fluctuates every year. It's tied to a CPI, so okay. That kind of changes a little bit.
All right, I understand there's also a benefit to a vet who's 100% disabled?
There's a $150,000 homestead exemption actually that was created a few years ago for veterans, so that's been put in place also.
Good, I'm glad. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. So the sheriff sends out your bill, you got till 12/31 to pay it, or you start paying penalties and interest.
Yeah.
What are penalties and interests?
Well, they're usually, and of course that's the sheriff's office issue, but they're usually about 1% a month, and the fees and some of the other penalties in there could vary depending on the property.
Okay. If you don't pay over a certain period of time, after which, as I understand it, the sheriff is going to do what's called a sheriff's sale. It is,
and it's called a tax sale, and they hold that usually in the summertime every year. So if you haven't paid your taxes up to that time, they can auction off that property. It becomes a very big property for property owners. I deal with a lot of people who have gone through this process. So you lose your homestead exemption because we have to transfer that property over to the tax buyer, because actually that's a document that's been filed in conveyance that transfers the property ownership to them. Although you have 3 years as the property owner to go back and pay the back taxes on that, and it stays yours. They do not have the legal right to that property until the 3 years is up.
So no right to take it over, seize it, occupy it, sell it, do anything?
Exactly.
Okay. And so after a certain, do you know how long the sheriff waits before they say, we're going to go ahead and seize your property and sell it?
Well, I think...
Is it a case-by-case determination?
It is, and I think if the tax buyer who acquires that property at the tax sale, they would actually have to go to court in order to acquire the property. So it depends on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, and so once a year, people who hadn't paid their taxes are subject to having their property seized and sold for the taxes and whatever additional expenses have been incurred. And then they have 3 years to redeem it.
Correct.
And basically pay the costs associated with it being seized and sold, all the back taxes, all the penalties and interest, the whole bit.
Absolutely.
And then they get it back.
Yes, okay. we put it back into the name, and we put the homestead back on it, and it comes back into commerce.
Okay, but if they don't do it, ownership is transferred to that person who bought it.
It very well can be.
Okay.
It's actually transferred on their tax roll the year that they acquired at the tax sale, but the tax buyer does not have legal right to it yet.
Got it. All right, and so as I understand it, this is big business.
It is.
Explain to the folks.
Well, when you're getting 1%, I think they get 5% up front, then 1% a month. And when you're buying these properties in bulk, like they come in and do every single year, it's a money-making business for these people.
Tens of millions of dollars are spent, huh?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's
so
incredible.
These big guys come in, they buy all this tax property, and then these folks have to either buy it back from them or they take
they can lose it, yeah. And that's the thing. I think most of the time these tax buyers, I don't think they actually want the property, more or less. They're looking to, it's a money-making.
17%
absolutely.
rate of return.
So it's just, they're looking for the interest on it.
Really interesting. All right, so let's shift gears again. Let's explain to the folks, I guess the foundation or the type of property that you own that is subject to taxation, please.
Well, you have residential property, which, valuation-wise, is assessed at 10% on the land, 10% on the home. Commercial is 10% on the land, 15% on the building. Then you also have public service properties where it's assessed at 25%.
Okay, so give me a typical calculation on a house. You said it's 10%. Let's say the house's fair market value is $100,000. Okay, so the assessed value is going to be 10% of that.
10,000.
So it'd be 10,000.
Correct.
Let's say it's a 10 mills tax, but you got a homestead exemption. 10 mills would be $1,000, right?
Correct.
You got a homestead, you're not going to owe anything because the homestead's $7,500.
Correct.
Okay. On the other hand, if it's a business property, the land would be at 10%, same calculation.
Yeah.
But no homestead exemption for it or the building, but the building's at 15%.
Yeah, it's a little different animal because it depends on, as far as calculating the bill, what would be. It depends on what the land value is and then how much, what the building value is to determine what's going to be, how much of the 15% is going to be.
And then I also understand movable business property is subject to taxation?
It is, whether it's inventory, furniture and fixtures, equipment. So people who have a snowball stand all the way up to the Exxon refinery gets a movable property.
And there's a form, they can voluntarily value the property, or you guys decide. All right, we'll continue this on the next segment. It's Locke, Meredith with Legal Lines. My guest, Brian Wilson. He's Baton Rouge Parish Tax Assessor. We'll be right back.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith with a Legal Lines tip for you. Document your claim. What do I mean? Whenever you present a claim, whether it's for injuries in an automobile collision or for a breach of contract case or a business claim, it all boils down to documentation and evidence. For example, when you go to trial, basically both sides are presenting their evidence of what they believe to be their case. For example, also, if you're involved in an automobile collision, document the event. Talk to all the parties who are involved. Get their names, address, contact information, insurance info. Talk to the witnesses on the scene. Also get their contact information. Take photographs. With the phones we all have these days, everybody can take a picture and that paints 1,000 words. So document your claim. The Legal Lines tip from me, Locke Meredith, to you is document the claim.
This has been Legal Lines Tips.
Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. Pleased to have on the show for the first time Brian Wilson. He's East Baton Rouge Parish tax assessor. Brian, we were talking about, bottom line is the taxes are based on the type of property you own and where it's located.
Correct.
As it relates to the type of property that's owned, private residential land and buildings are taxed at 10%.
Correct.
The commercial business property, building itself is 15%,
Correct.
but the land is 10%.
That's right.
Okay. And then there's also taxation relating on special occasions where the property is located, like whether you're in the city limits or outside the city limits or in specially designated areas?
It is. It just
Explain to
all
folks.
depends on where the property is located. We have 4 different school systems in East Baton Rouge Parish. You have EBR, you have Central, you have Baker, you have Zachary. So each of those particular agencies have a different amount of millage. If you're in the unincorporated portions of the parish.
Meaning out of the
outside of the city limits, correct. And then you have different fire districts that you may be in, where the Central Fire District or St. George or East Side. So all those agencies have different millages, so depending on where you live at, you may have the same value property, but your tax bills could be different.
Does the sheriff's tax, is that tax on all residents of East Baton Rouge Parish or just those living outside the city limits?
No, the sheriff's, everybody in the parish, every piece of property in the parish pays that
Because
millage.
his jurisdiction is over both
It
city
is,
and
it's
the
parish-wide, correct.
Okay. And so that kind of explains that scenario. As I understand it too, their business property that's movable, copy machines,
Absolutely.
desk, whatever, that is subject to taxation.
It is.
Explain, we kind of ran out of time last segment. Explain how that goes about.
Absolutely. We send out self-reporting tax forms usually in February of each year to each business in the parish, and then they report back to us the assets they acquired as of January 1 of that year, and if the inventory, if they carry it, and they are taxed on those properties.
Okay, and if they fail to fill out that, and I think it had to be by April 1 or something
It
like that?
It is, and if they don't fill it out, then we place an arbitrary assessment on it, depending on what type of business it is. If they were reported before, we may bump up the value on it 10%, and that may continue until we kind of get somebody's attention, because that's the only way we have to evaluate these properties.
So you're going to get punished probably by paying higher than if you just reported the value.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. Now, one, I guess, adjustment would be the age of the property?
Yeah, depending on the movable assets, yeah.
Right.
And we have a depreciation schedule
assets.
set up by Louisiana Tax Commission, actually, that values these properties depending on its age, depending on the type of property it is, whether it's a copy machine, whether it's furniture,
Okay.
depending on the life of that particular piece
And
of
that's
property.
not a calculation that the individual does. They
No.
just, I guess, give you all the age of the equipment. And y'all use your
Yes, they give us the
depreciation
year they
schedule.
bought it and the type of equipment that it is, and then we have a formula that we use set up by the Louisiana Tax Commission that determines the value of that property.
Okay. And explain to the folks who gets the money. Who we pay the taxes, who gets the money? Because it's not just one person or one city.
No, it doesn't go into a general fund. Every single dollar that's paid in property tax goes to a particular agency. It's dedicated to each particular agency, whether it's the sheriff or the library system or the schools or the fire department, mosquito abatement, EMS, and on down the line. We have about 32 different agencies who receive property tax revenue. So, but every single dollar that's collected stays locally right here in East Baton Rouge Parish.
And so, as I understand it, those agencies have to go to the Metro Council to ask for a tax increase or a renewal of a tax?
They do. And I don't, not necessarily a renewal, but if they want to roll forward, obviously that goes before the Metro Council. And also if they want to go for it, if they need additional money, then they have to go before the Metro Council to do that.
Okay, and then the Metro Council then debates whether or not to even allow a vote to take place.
Absolutely, they can determine whether to put it on the ballot or not.
And so folks can be involved in the process at that point on whether or not they're going to be taxed. And then subsequently, a vote is actually held by the population.
Correct, and it's up to the voters to decide.
Okay, so in that scenario, the Metro Council decides.
Yes.
As I understand, for elected officials, you guys get to decide.
That particular elected official can make that decision on their own, whether it's the sheriff or myself, who I have a millage also that funds my office.
Okay. So you've been there 26 years. Yeah. Tell me what you think is going right and what you think is going wrong.
Well, you know, the property tax system is very complex, and not a lot of people understand it. That's why we do the website to try to educate people and things like that. You know, it seems historically in this parish, a lot of people are inclined to vote more for a sales tax than they are a property tax. I'm not exactly sure why that is. Maybe they don't think that the property tax is fair across the board. But you know, I think with the system that we have, it does its best to work. So we see a lot of changes in the legislature every year that want to either change the Homestead Exemption or make adjustments to the way property tax system is working, but we'll continue to watch it as time goes on.
So, as I understand, there are occasions where errors take place, and in a way, I guess, you look at how valuation is made, it seems somewhat subjective in the sense that you got a guy going out there looking at different properties, trying to figure out what one's worth more because of this amenity or not. And I think I've read on occasion, in fact, when you first started, you had to increase property values by 50% on some places.
We did. When I came in 2002, my first reassessment was in 2004.
Bet you weren't real popular.
No, we weren't. You know, and so we had to make a lot of drastic changes at that time. And so, but the main thing is to be fair and to be equitable. And I think if people are paying the same across the board for what a property is worth, and I think they understand that, and they think they're getting a fair shake, and they're paying the same as what somebody else's is. You know, not exactly the same thing, but we have to come within a range.
Do y'all have a certain range?
We do. It's within 90 and 110%. So we have to fluctuate.
So there's 20%
Absolutely.
variable.
Yes.
Okay. So no changes are going to be made if somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, dude, on this digital map, it's saying he's 200 and I'm, 180." You're going to say, that's close enough?
Yeah, I think so. Again, when you're dealing with that many properties and you're doing mass appraisal, you're not going to hit an assessment right on the button. So I think whether you're coming within that range, I think everyone's comfortable with that.
Okay. And then I was reading that occasionally there's parishes, I think in this case it was Ascension, where they went for 5 or 6 years without reappraising the property. Is that right?
Well, I think they had some issues that may have had some improvements, or homes were actually not on the tax roll. I don't think we've had that case in East Baton Rouge Parish with the permit department that we have here in EBR. I think it works very well, and so I think we've been very successful to make sure that the properties are on the tax roll.
Okay. And kind of one other issue, whether it's business or residential, is if somebody, let's say, adds an addition to their house, okay, that's going to, I presume, improve and increase the value.
It will.
So how do you guys kind of keep up with that?
Well, the same as when somebody builds a new home or a new commercial building, obviously they have to go through the permit department to do that. We receive those permits electronically from them, and so depending on the square footage and the type of construction it is, that'll determine how much of an increase in value that we'll have to go.
And do y'all actually go out and inspect it?
We
or
do.
It's just,
we do.
Okay. Fantastic. Brian, thank you so much. Appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.
This is Locke, Meredith, Legal Lines. My guest, Brian Wilson, East Baton Rouge Parish Tax Assessor. Thanks for being with us.